nature northwest, and talk nature and some of the things associated with good weather and other things besides. Anyhow, Aengus, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, John. Lovely day.
Great day again, and good to see you. So just to remind people as well that we're streaming this as well online if anybody wants to have a look. Now, the good weather's bringing more of us out to the beach, and with that comes a few things that we suppose we need to be aware of, because we've heard a lot in the last week about the jellyfish, and also about a little jellyfish can be hard to spot sometimes, but also there's a wee sneaky fella that lies in the sand and can give you a right bit of a sting.
Yeah, there is the weaver fish, it's called, it's one of those things when we venture into nature's world, or outside of our own comfort zone, I suppose, we're venturing into the world of other characters that have been living there, in some cases for millions of years, depending on the type of species, and getting on with their business very well until we come along. And weaver fish, they bury themselves onto the sand, waiting for their prey. They're very small little fish, but right onto the sand at low tide. So it's only at the lowest tides that you'll come across them.
And why do they hide in the sand? What kind of prey? I mean, they're not after our feet. So why do they hide in there? What are they looking for?
Yeah, well, the ocean's remarkable. The amount of stuff that's in the ocean that we can't see, the amount of life the ocean holds. So we all know how important the tropical rainforest is for oxygen, for instance. And you can ask any child at any school, and they'll tell you rainforests and trees give us oxygen, but only half of the oxygen comes from the rainforest. The other half comes from, or a little more than half actually, comes from plankton in the sea. And plankton is the general word for small stuff in the sea, really. Some plankton are plants, and they photosynthesize. They capture carbon and give us oxygen. And some plankton then are tiny little creatures that prey on other plankton. And of course, they're the basis for the food chains all around the sea. So they keep the seas healthy. And some of these little creatures, little tiny shrimps and whatnot, would fall prey to the weaver fish.
Okay. And you can pack a right punch, and you can get a nasty enough sting, and there's a bit of swelling. What's the advice if you do get stung by a weaver fish? And you don't know, because they're so well camouflaging themselves, and you don't know what happened and how you got jabbed or how you got stung.
Yeah, if you're going in, the thing to remember is it's only really at low tide, and quite often only at the very lowest tides. And every 2 weeks with the new moons and the full moons, we get a bigger range of tide, higher high tides and lower low tides. And they call those the spring tides. Nothing to do with spring at all. That's an old Scandinavian word for sprungen, to rise. So it's the biggest tides, the highest highs and the lowest lows. So if you're heading out into the beach and it's a very low tide, and around Donegal, that's normally around about lunchtime. If it's low tide around about lunchtime, you know you're near a full moon or a new moon, always in Donegal on our coast. And that's where you might come across the weaver fish. If ever I was going in, or I was going in with children, I'd ask them to just kick their feet a little bit, stomp their feet a wee bit as they go in, because the weaver fish, it's just underneath the surface of the sand, but it'll feel those vibrations and it'll scuttle off because it does not want to get stamped on.
Okay.
But if you do end up stamping on it, they have little spines in their fin at the back, and some of those spines hold a bit of poison, which if they go into the sole of your foot, you'll know all about it. You feel they give you a good bang.
And a bit like a jellyfish, warm water is good if you do get a sting.
As hot as you can bear. There's not a huge amount you can do about it, but as hot as you can bear. I've been stung by weaver fish myself, and I remember it. So as hot water as you can bear, it will go down after a couple of hours. It's very unusual for people to have any more than a sore reaction to it. So it's the kind of thing you keep an eye on, come out of the water, but try and find whatever local premises nearby and get as hot of water as you can. And that, some say that draws out the poison. Perhaps that's true, perhaps that's not. But certainly that extra heat helps ease the pain in your foot. But after a couple of hours, it'll be gone, and you won't know any more of it.
All right. So make a bit of noise as you go in. It's just a low tide, and make your presence felt, and
make your presence felt. And also to remember that first, like, they're not on all beaches by any means. So you will get them on some beaches around Donegal, but majority of beaches don't have weaver fish. The lifeguards, it's well worth asking if there are lifeguards there. No, the lifeguards are there 7 days a week at the moment. It's a great service on all of the blue flag beaches and some of the other ones as well. And ask them, talk to them about it, and they'll tell you if there was weaver fish in that area or not. But it is a low tide thing. You're pretty unlucky if you stand on it. So don't let it put you off. Get into the sea, get out and enjoy it. Summer is passing by, and we finally got warm weather, so get out and enjoy the nature of the sea.
Something else that shouldn't put us off is jellyfish, but it often does. But they're only really a major cause for concern when you see big concentrations of them. And there's been some talk in the last week or two about Portuguese man o' war. I think if one of these is spotted off the coast, it's like there's a national alert.
I think, don't they call it silly season for news this time of year? I suppose there's not a huge amount perhaps in the headlines, and some of the media outlets like to grab these headlines and make them dramatic. And yet we get lots of different types of jellyfish. Always have, we always will. Perhaps they're increasing in numbers. That might be the case, all right. And there's a few different reasons why that might be so. But the thing to remember is one of the most common jellyfish, the moon jellyfish, has those kind of purpley pink rings on them, 4 purpley pink rings. And other than that, they're see-through. They can't sting you at all. So they're completely harmless. So if you see them, they look a bit weird. They look very beautiful when they're in the water. But they've no brain, they've no heart. They're incredible, these things. These jellyfish evolved over 300 million years ago, and they're still sharing the sea with us now. Or we're sharing the sea with them, I suppose. They've been here so long. So they are incredible creatures, and they're a food source for a lot of different things, especially when they're smaller. But the purple ones, which are the most common, don't sting you whatsoever. And the ones that look a bit like the spokes of a wheel or a compass wheel, the compass jellyfish, which is the brown lines coming out from the centerpiece, the spokes of a bicycle wheel, perhaps. They can give you a mild sting, all right. But again, it's nothing that wouldn't be anything to put you off,
Okay. All right, let's turn to birds. And there's the common crane in the news today because 2 of them have successfully hatched 2 chicks at re-wetted peatlands. And they haven't said where these are. I'm guessing that they're down in the Midlands somewhere. But it's great news because they haven't bred in Ireland for years.
Years and years, yeah. They were native to
Ireland.
Hundreds of years, yeah, since they were breeding here. Now there was 2 chicks hatched last year for the first time. There was a pair in Midlands and on re-wetted bogs, as you say, and they attempted to have a couple of chicks, or attempted to have a family for a couple of years. Wasn't successful. Last year it was. The chicks got predated, they think. This year, that's great again to hear that there's 2 pairs. There were something that was native to here. And like so many different things, they were under ferocious pressure as humans expanded, as we drained the bogs to turn some in for agriculture, sometimes for fuel. And bogs are often in the news these days. People get very emotional about turf cutting and the rest of it. But no matter what way you slice it or dice it, it's bad for the air, it's bad for the environment, it's bad for the planet, and it's bad for nature. Might be good for your household bills, but that's all it's good for, unfortunately. So a lot of these re-wetting projects are going on. Not just in the Midlands, but in Donegal as well. And when they re-wet the bogs, they bring the water table back up, and it acts then as a bog again. It's able to capture carbon, act as flood control, but also the unique biodiversity, the unique nature that lives on bogs is able to come back. And these cranes are showing the success of that program.
Yeah, absolutely. And in general, at the moment, I suppose there's a lot of small birds leaving the nests and making their way. So keep an eye out for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because the cranes are, of course, the opposite. They're huge. And sometimes people call herons cranes. And herons are the big grey characters with the big long beak. And you'll see them standing very, very still at the sides of rivers. Whereas the cranes are even bigger than that again. And they're much lighter in colour. Whereas this time of year, our hedgerows, any little wild bits, the bushes, the shrubs around us, and you'll hear the birds. You'll hear them cheeping. They've stopped singing so much. But there's a huge amount of baby birds. There's more birds now, of course, than any time of year. And they're relying on those hedgerows for shelter first, because they're juvenile birds. They're only trying to figure it out. And they're relying on them for food. That's where they'll get the most amount of insects, which is what they're eating, and caterpillars, and in some cases, little berries and whatnot. But also, you've got to remember the parent birds. At this time of year, the parent birds are changing their whole suit of feathers. So they're molting all of their feathers. So they're not able to fly nearly as well as normal. So again, it's the reason why those hedgerows are so important for them. But if you do find a baby bird, if you find something that's just really recently come out of a nest, leave it alone. Because mum and dad are watching you, but they won't come over to it as long as you're there. If you have a cat, lock up the cat. Cats are a disaster. They wipe out huge amounts of birds. Yeah. Handy for other things, but they wipe out huge amounts of birds. But leave the baby bird alone. If it's somewhere where you think it'll get damaged, you could scoop it up and pop it under a hedge, but don't move it far, because mum or dad are watching, and they'll feed them for about 2 weeks after they come out of the nest until they're independent.
Okay, you think you're doing good, and you look around and you don't see mommy or daddy, and you want to take it home and nurse it and give it hot milk or whatever, but really just move it into safety and leave it.
Yeah, because they have an amazing ability. A lot of the small birds, they if a cat or a human cutting a hedge or somebody interferes with their home, even before they can fly, they tend to burst out of their nest, or they can do if they're disturbed a bit too early. So sometimes you will come across birds this time of year hopping around on the ground that can't fly at all. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with them, though. And mum and dad is still feeding them, and we'll try and coax them back into shelter. And you'll hear mum or dad sometimes. If you ever see mum or dad, we were watching this in the course I was doing last week. We were watching a pied wagtail, the black and white birds, the little wagging tail on them. And you could see it calling, trying to lure its chicks out of the nest. It had food in its mouth, so it was trying to tempt them to do that first jump. And then, as I say, they feed them for that couple of weeks. And after that, they're on their own. I already see lots of young coal tits and robins and blue tits, in particular, in my garden. The coal tits and blue tits going up to the feeders. And they don't look like their parent birds for that first few weeks. They tend to be much more browny, greeny type colors, much more camouflaged. The robin, for instance, doesn't have a red breast for the first few weeks. It has a speckled front. So it looks like a mini thrush. And then come autumn time, it'll develop that red breast and start looking for its own territory.
Well, it's got nothing to do with birds, but it's called cuckoo spittle. Well, that's all what I ever heard it called growing up. And you see it sitting on the top of the leaves and plants and stuff, and it's got nothing to do with the cuckoo.
No, nothing to do with the cuckoo.
I've seen it around now recently.
Yeah, and it's quite late actually this year, but we've had a very damp and very cold spring and early summer. So there might be a reason why those are so late. Normally, you'll start seeing those from the end of April onwards. And that's that little balls of, or little blobs of white foam. And you'll see on the wildflowers, on the plants around about in your garden, when you're out and about for a walk, you'll see them all over the place, all over the country. And they usually emerge as the cuckoos are arriving. So people used to associate the two, I suppose. And hence it's called cuckoo spit. And I sometimes laugh with the school groups that I'm with, saying that the cuckoos might evict other people's children and take over a home and get mum and dad to feed them from another family, but they're not so rude that they'd spit. They're not that low. So it's not their spit at all, of course. It's a little bug called a frog hopper, and the frog hopper eats the sap of the plant. Most bugs are attacking plants. Some bugs then are attacking them and so on. But the big danger for plants, apart from humans, of course, is bugs, is insects. Loads of insects are trying to eat different types of plants. So they eat away at the sap. They don't seem to injure the plants too much, so it's not something you have to worry about if it's on a flower that you like. But then they blow out these bubbles, these frothy bubbles, and when they're very small. And they cover themselves, those bubbles, perfect for the bit of heat that's supposed to be coming, and also perfect to trick that baby robin that's looking around for its food to eat. It wants to eat hundreds of bugs a day, so the cuckoo spit bug needs to know how to hide.
So perfectly normal, part of our ecosystem, and no way harmless.
No, yeah. Now there's been some headlines in some of the British magazines and British papers, and they were getting worried about it. There is a bacteria on continental Europe. It's not an issue in Ireland whatsoever. There's a bacteria that can damage plants, and it's sometimes found in cuckoo spit, or they believe it can be transferred from cuckoo spit to cuckoo spit. That hasn't never been detected in Britain, certainly never in Ireland, but it must have been another slow news day. There was big warnings about it, and it's a pity that kind of thing. It does make people look, but in a negative way, and it put negative association. Whereas those bugs, they're completely harmless. And when children go fishing in them with their finger and they find these tiny little green characters with these two little tiny black eyes walking slowly around their fingers, they love them. And then when those bugs get a bit bigger, they'll get about not quite a centimeter long, and they go a bit browner. And then they don't need to produce those bubbles anymore because they can hop. The frog hopper, they can hop many, many times their own body height. And that's the way of escaping. But they're no danger. They're not a danger to plants. They're certainly not a danger to us. So leave them alone.
Okay. A caller asks, did we have at one time yellow wagtails in Donegal? I have memories of seeing them back in the 80s.
Yeah, so there's three different wagtails that we have. Well, four actually. There's white and the pieds. They're quite similar to each other. But then there is one that you'll often get down in the rivers. And they're very specific to riversides. And in fact, in Ramelton, the town I'm living in, we have them there. And we have them in a lot of rivers. I was up in Glen Evan Waterfall last week, and there was some of them there as well. They're called grey wagtails. They're grey. The top half of the body is grey. The bottom half is yellow, bright yellow. And so you'll often see them in the rivers. But if you're not looking into the river, if you're walking past with the headphones in or you're busy thinking about whatever, if you're not looking around for the nature, you won't notice them because they're right there beside you, flitting around. And then there is also a bird called the yellow wagtail, which is yellow all over. They're unusual. I've seen them in the Midlands and the lakes. In the Midlands, that's the only place I've ever seen them. There isn't a huge number of them. I haven't seen them in Donegal. But look into the rivers. Always stop whenever you pull up in a town anywhere else. Put your head over the wall and look into a river, because there's dippers in there, there's kingfishers, there's wagtails, there's birds that you won't find literally a few meters inland from the river or the watercourse.
Well, we're melting a good place for that down on the quay for sure. Finally, Aengus, I want to ask you about something that looks like a strawberry, but I don't think that it is. It's like an orange strawberry, and I see these growing in the wild, and an awful lot of them. Have you any idea what they are?
Yeah, and are they quite big, quite bushy? So as tall as yourself?
About the same size as a strawberry. Maybe not a particularly big strawberry, but around about the same size as your average strawberry.
Yeah, because there's a few different plants that it could be. So we do have wild strawberries, which will be very small strawberries. They look just like the strawberry, but they're very small. And there's another character called the barren strawberry. So people will often think they've escaped out of a garden, but they're native plants that they're growing here quite happily in our woodlands and our ditches and in the slightly damper places. And they have that strawberry shape of a leaf, which a lot of people recognize, and the strawberry looking flower. The barren ones don't produce strawberries. The little wild strawberries, the Irish native wild strawberries, produce tiny little strawberries. But there's another character called the salmon berry, and I wonder if it's the salmon berry that you're thinking of, because they grow in stalky bushes, and they've got soft little thorns on them. And they can grow quite tall, these bushes, about as tall as myself. And they have this orange berry, looks like a strawberry, looks like a raspberry. I wouldn't eat it. I wouldn't, leave it alone. But they're an invasive species. They've been brought in from somewhere else. They were planted in people's gardens, and then birds eat those berries and they pass the seeds around the place, much like they do for normal strawberries or raspberries. So if you do see any of that and it has those orange raspberries on it, chop it out, remove it. And be aware, if you do pull it out, you'll be able to pull them out of the ground reasonably easily, or maybe with a bit of a spade they'll come out. But out of their roots will come more little suckers and more bushes will come. So you'll have to tease those roots out of the garden or out of the ground as well if you come across them. They're reasonably easy to do if they haven't got a very strong hold.
It has been in sort of rougher areas that I've seen them, and they do look like something that just would have spread, didn't fit in there, so to speak. All right then. Well, there we'll leave it. Thanks as always, Aengus.
Brilliant. Thanks very much.
Is now here. People adopted.